Blue is often thought of as the most powerful card in the game, largely thanks to its history of being overpowered in the early days of the game. However, that doesn't stop the color from having its fair share of stinkers. Blue has plenty of cards that do little to nothing when you actually play them. Today, we're going to go over the worst of the worst. Cards make you wonder why they were even printed when you read them. And at number 10, we have Scornful Egotist. This is a 1/1 human wizard with a mana cost of 7 and 1 blue. It has more for 1 blue, meaning you can pay 3 mana to cast this card from your hand as a face-down 2/2 creature. Then, while it's on the field, you can turn it face up at any time for its morph cost. However, that's all the card does. It's a 1/1 for 8 mana that you have to cast as a 2/2 for 3 mana, which is bad for very obvious reasons. Both halves of this card are overcosted, though obviously the morph mode is much better. In fact, turning Egotist face up essentially makes it worse. You're paying an entire mana to shrink Egotist by 1 power and toughness. There is a reason for this though, but it's a bit of a strange one. Egotist was printed back in Scourge, a set which had a theme based around caring about the mana value of cards. Cards like Rush of Knowledge got more powerful if you have a card with a high mana value in play. Egotist was essentially a way to get a card with a high mana value onto the battlefield without actually having to get that much mana. It allowed you to get an 8 mana card into play by only paying 4 mana. And while the card wasn't any good, it did make your Dispersal Shield a lot more useful. However, this doesn't actually make the card good. The payoff here just isn't high enough to justify trying to spend 4 mana on a 1/1 creature, especially when the card is so weak to removal. This is the main reason Egotist isn't higher on this list, as it does have a few synergies which make it less awful. The second reason that it isn't higher on this list is that you can cast it as a 2/2 for 3 mana. This is bad as it's very below curve, but it's a better stat line than most of the creatures on this list. It's significantly worse than the vast majority of blue creatures, but it can at least trade with something in some circumstances. The fact that the card can theoretically just be bad rather than outright terrible does save it from getting any more shame. But the fact that it's worse than literally any other morph creature in every circumstance outside of synergizing with a few bad cards lands it on this list anyway. And at number 9, we have Homarid. This is a 2/2 Homarid with the mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has abilities where it enters a battlefield with a tide counter on it. And during your upkeep, you put a tide counter at Homarid. Whenever Homarid has 4 or more tide counters on it, you remove them all. Finally, when it has exactly 1 tide counter on it, it's a 1/1. And while it has exactly 3 counters on it, it's a 3/3. Fun fact, this is only one of a handful of creatures of Magic whose name is exactly the same as its creature type, alongside cards like Dathi Horror. Less fun fact, the card is terrible. How the card works in practice is that it comes in as a 1/1, then becomes a 2/2 next turn as you have 2 tide counters on it. Next turn it grows to a 3/3 thanks to having 3 tide counters. The next turn it will have no counters, so it goes back to a 2/2. The end result is that it fluctuates between being a 2/2 to either a 3/3 or a 1/1 every other round. Before we get on to why this fluctuation is kind of bad, we have to start with the fact that the stats are never really good. A 3/3 for 3 mana would have been kind of impressive back in the day for blue, just because creatures were so bad back then. However, it still wasn't good enough to make a vanilla 3 mana 3/3 playable. Of course, Homarid wasn't a 3/3 for 3 mana, it was more of a 2/2 for 3 mana that could be better or worse on certain turns. This alone makes the card bad, as most of the time it's very below rate. The stats are just too low to be impactful, but Homarid's fluctuating stat line is usually a downside rather than an upside. Sure, it's sometimes a bit larger than usual, but being a 1/1 for 3 mana for any amount of time is incredibly easy to exploit. Even 1 mana creatures like Thraben and Spectre can kill it in combat and survive. While this is a more recent card, even random vanillas like Grizzly Bears has better stat line than Homarid most of the time for less mana. And Bears was printed in the very first set. You're only better than Bears when you're a 3/3. But that's almost never the case. You're only a 3/3 every 4th turn, so most of the time you're still losing to Bears. These 3 turns of having an outright bad creature are always easy to exploit, as it will just open up more attacks for your opponent. Making this even worse is the lack of control over the size of your Homarid. It just ebbs and flows with the tide, regardless of the board state. Homarid is one of the most overcomplicated cards in the game, considering all it does is shift between different amounts of garbage. And at number 8, we have Wilderness Hypnotist. This is a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 2 blue. It is an ability where you can tap it to give target red or green creature -2/-0 till end of turn. Like Homarid before it, this is a creature that has various stats for too much mana. Hypnotist's stats are even worse though, as a 1/3 for 4 mana is completely unacceptable. While it does have an ability to make up for that, it's also bad. Tapping to give a creature -2/-0 with no restriction would have made it draft chaff that no one would look twice at. It would be acceptable, but reducing a creature's power just isn't enough to justify playing the card. It can prevent damage and make combat better for you, but most aggro decks will have already put on too much pressure by the time Hypnotist comes down. 1 power is so little that it won't be able to kill much in combat, as very few 2-drops have 1 toughness. It also isn't exactly much of a threat to your opponent's life total. All of this is topped up by the completely unnecessary restrictions on the card. Only being able to affect creatures that are 1 or 2 of the 5 colors in the game is just very limiting. There's no guarantee what color of cards your opponent will be on, which forces you to play Hypnotist in your sideboard. Of course, the card is so bad at what it does that you wouldn't even sideboard into it. Even if your opponent was on a red or green deck, there are so many better color hit cards you can play instead of Hypnotist. Now, this card is mostly being thought of in a limited context, so merely the existence of better cards doesn't outmode it. But you'd probably better off just continue to play better creatures against any green or red deck. Even other mediocre merfolk at common, like Merrill Levitator, would do more against these decks than Hypnotist. Considering that the card can't even compete with other commons in its color and its limited format, it's pretty easily one of the worst creatures in blue. And at number 7, we have Dichotomancy. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 7 and 2 blue. It has the effect where, for each tapped non-land permanent target opponent controls, you search your library for a card with the same name and put it into the battlefield under your control, then shuffle. It also has Suspend 3 for 1 and 2 blue. This allows you to pay the suspend cost to exile it from your hand with 3 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter from it, and when the last one's removed, you can cast it without paying its mana cost. While the effect of Dichotomancy certainly isn't weak, there are way too many things holding it back for it to ever work out. For one, having a mana value of 9 makes the card hard to play. Most cards with this mana value have pretty game warping effects, like Time Stretch, which for 10 mana lets you take 2 extra turns, or even Omniscience, which lets you cast all your other cards for free. However, Dichotomancy's effect is pretty weak in practice. For one, it requires your opponent to have a board state in order for the card to do literally anything. Any card that relies on your opponent to be good is immediately suspect, but this goes doubly so for one that requires so much commitment. However, even in this class of card, such as Clone Legion and Insurrection, Dichotomancy requires you to meet 2 additional requirements for it to work. First, your opponent needs to have extra copies of the cards in their deck for you to steal. This alone isn't much of an issue, as they will usually be playing a few extra copies of any cards they have in play. However, there are times when they'll be out of copies of a certain card, or will have tokens of the field that you won't be able to copy. The biggest restriction, though, is that your opponent's cards need to have been tapped for Dichotomancy to copy them. This means that you'll either have to use another card to forcibly tap your opponent's cards, or wait until they can tap the cards themselves. Neither of these are attractive options. To try and make up for these restrictions, Dichotomancy has the upside of being able to suspend. Unfortunately, there are few effects you want your opponent to see coming more than Dichotomancy. Since it requires your opponent's cards to be tapped, they can get around the suspend by just not using any of their non-land cards for a turn. In order for suspended Dichotomancy to do anything, you essentially have to combine it with tapping effects. This means you're using at least 4 mana and 2 cards on top of waiting 3 turns to get a copy of one of your opponent's cards, which is far weaker than simply using something like Control Magic. Dichotomancy finds itself at the perfect intersection of too much mana, too specific in what it does, and requiring far too much setup to ever see play. And at number 6, we have Cephalid Snitch. This is a 1/1 Cephalid wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is an ability where you can sacrifice a snitch to make a target creature lose protection from black until end of turn. Protection makes it so the protected permanent can't be blocked by, targeted by, dealt damage by, or enchanted by anything it's protected from. In this case, black cards. Snitch is another blue creature with very low stats for cost. Most colors have some 2/1/1s here and there that rely on having a useful ability to make up for being bad bodies. Cards like Elvish Mystic and Baleful Strix both draw a card when they enter the field, for example. Most of Snitch's relevance as a card is relying on its ability, an ability which only exists to counter a very specific ability that may not even be relevant. In order for Snitch's ability to come up, you must not only be playing both blue and black, but your opponent must be playing a card with protection from black exactly. While protection from black is a good ability against certain decks, it's not exactly all over the place. Cards like Brave the Elements or Sanctifer Envec have seen play, but they're not showing up in every match or anything. Not to mention that if you're really worried about trying to deal with pro-black creatures, you have several far more practical options in most formats. You have black removal like Edicts that get around targeting, and since you're also playing blue, you have all the blue interaction to deal with these threats. There's really no world where you would play Snitch to allow you to fatal push a creature rather than just unsummon it and try to counter it on the way back down. Bounce spells and counter spells are generally actually good cards, and card advantage wise, it's identical to using Snitch. So the only thing that gives Snitch purpose, countering pro-black cards, is done better by actually useful blue cards. For Snitch to be worth playing, it would probably need to just statistically remove protection from black from all of your opponent's creatures. And even then, the ability would be so niche it wouldn't see competitive play. It at least would save it from showing up on this list though. And at number 5, we have Merchant Ship. This is a 0/2 human with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has abilities where it can't attack unless the defending player controls an island. If you don't control an island, you have to sacrifice the ship. And whenever Merchant Ship attacks and isn't blocked, you gain 2 life. It was inevitable that a creature with island home ended up on this list. This is the now defunct keyword for both the ship's island related abilities, and it's pretty intuitive why it's terrible. The ability is purely negative and makes it so that your creatures are all defenders if your opponent is on the wrong colors. Not to mention that it gives them another weakness for your opponent to exploit. If you're relying on steam vents to keep your Merchant Ship around, you'll lose to your opponent casting a Blood Moon and taking away its land types. Most defender creatures are balanced around their massive downside, usually having very high toughness and other useful abilities to make them playable. However, island home creatures like the ship are usually designed as if your opponent will have an island, despite that not all being a guarantee. Beyond being a member of one of the weakest groups of cards in the game, Ship would be a weak creature even without island home. 0 power creatures have a hard time ever seeing play, and Ship's ability to gain you a massive 2 life a turn isn't exactly turning heads. Your opponent can easily block Ship with literally anything to stop this life gain on the off chance that it's relevant. And thanks to how many 1 mana 2/1s there are, you'll likely lose the Ship in this trade. It's not even a particularly good blocker either, as 2 toughness is, once again, easy to get around. Ship's only upside is that it's such a cheap creature, so while it won't do anything, at least you won't be wasting too much mana on it. And at number 4, we have Saprazzan Raider. This is a 1/2 merfolk with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It is ability where, whenever it becomes blocked, you return Raider to its owner's hand. This is the final creature on this list, and the worst of the bunch. It actually makes most of the other creatures on this list look fairly playable by comparison. Obviously, the rate is horrible. Only having 1 power is pathetic, and 2 toughness leaves it tied with Merchant Ship. In the modern day, there are 1 mana creatures with this stat line that aren't particularly good, like Rustwing Falcon, which even has the upside of flying. However, for some completely inexplicable reason, Raider's only ability is a downside. Bouncing back to your hand whenever the card becomes blocked is actively horrible. Any creature at all can block Raider and force it back to your hand because the ability will trigger and bounce the Raider before you even get to damage. Even if your opponent can't block Raider, it's a 1 power creature, so it can safely be ignored by your opponent. The only other possible use for this card is as a blocker, and once again, it's fairly weak in this role. It won't even bounce to your hand when it blocks, which is one of the only places this kind of ability could be useful, as it would give you infinite chump blocks. The card essentially does nothing and doesn't even have the decency to cost an appropriately tiny amount of mana. And at number 3, we have Erosion. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 3 blue. It has Enchant Land and the ability where at the beginning of your upkeep of the Enchanted Land's controller, you destroy that land unless they pay 1 or 1 life. This card would have actually been pretty good if it weren't for the last 3 words of the effect. Essentially, Erosion is a weird version of Stone Rain, getting rid of a land for 3 mana, albeit in a roundabout way. It would make it so that you couldn't use the land for mana, no matter what you did. However, they decided that, in addition to being able to pay with mana, you should also be able to prevent destruction by paying life. This instantly transforms the card from a Stone Rain into a feedback. That card also could have been on this list, actually, as paying 3 mana to deal 1 damage to your opponent for every turn is one of the worst effects imaginable. A single Erosion will put your opponent on a 20-turn clock, giving them more than enough time to find some sort of answer to Erosion. However, this is made even worse by Erosion's modality. Throughout the early game where mana production is very important, you can pay life to keep your land around and play uninterrupted. However, on any turn when you don't need the land, you can pay 1 to keep it around instead. And at the very late game, when you have too many lands around to even use, you can just let it die. At least feedback will always deal damage for you. The 3 options Erosion gives your opponent makes it so that it will never be impactful. No matter the stage of the game, your opponent can either pay life or mana to make Erosion a blank card. It's almost impressive that a card can have such powerful abilities while doing so little when it actually casts. And at number 2, we have Defensive Stance. This is another enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has Enchanted Creature and the ability where Enchanted Creature gets -1/+1. Defensive Stance starts out with a very weak premise. A creature aura that makes a creature more defensive. Auras are one of the weakest card types thanks to relying on other cards to do anything and leaving you open to 2-for-1s. The creature auras that I've seen play are typically cards like Rancor, which are extremely aggressive and allow for quick kills. Defensive Stance's only purpose is to allow your creature to survive slightly more combats, or to reduce the power of your opponent's power by 1 in a pinch. Neither of these uses do much of anything. 1 extra toughness rarely matters in combat, and it certainly isn't enough to spend an entire card on. Reducing your opponent's power 1 is also not a good use case, as it prevents far too little damage. Somehow, Wizards found an effect that was simultaneously not good enough to want on your creatures, and not harmful enough to want on your opponent's creatures. The card is so unimpactful and so niche, it's impressive that there's a blue card that somehow does even less. And at number 1, we have Baki's Curse. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 2 blue. It has the effect where Baki's Curse deals 2 damage to each creature for each aura attached to those creatures. Now, we spent the last couple of entries going over how bad auras as a card type are, so seeing a card that only exists to counter one of the worst kinds of cards in the game isn't a great start. Baki's Curse goes above and beyond in terms of awfulness though, not only being a narrow hate card for bad mechanic, but also doing a bad job at that role. 4 mana puts it in the same band as cards like Wrath of God, which will just destroy everything. This means you won't have to wait for your opponent to enchant their threats before you can get rid of them, which will rarely ever happen. The main upside of Curse is that it won't hit your own cards, but that's hardly worth it for how inconsistent Curse is. This is compounded by the fact that Baki's Curse just doesn't do enough damage. Many of the best auras are cards like Ethereal Armor or Daybreak Coronet, which gives you 2 or more toughness to whatever creature they're enchanted to, which means that Baki's Curse won't do enough damage to ever kill the creature. You would need to be using it alongside cards like Defensive Stance that would give minimal toughness boost for the curse to work as a removal spell. So if you want to build a deck around the worst cards imaginable, you could play the 2 cards alongside each other and use 2 cards to kill 1 toughness creatures. Curse is expensive, narrow, and will very rarely actually do what it sets out to do. It's about as close as you can get to a completely blank card, and easily the worst blue card in the game. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any of the cards you think we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.